Welcome to BIA Media, Canada's top black media provider. Whether you're looking for content on fashion, art, music, or simple lifestyle, we bring you the best the black community in Ottawa has to offer and so much more. And better yet, do you have a project you need help with? Well, look no further. We provide equipment, studio, and office space, as well as a team of dedicated individuals to help you bring those ideas to life. So don't wait. Check out our new website at biamedia.ca for more information on how to contact us and start creating today. BIA Media, your way.
All right, everyone. Good morning. Welcome to our second session of our course. We are going to pick up right where we left off by talking about various African women as resistance leaders. And now we are going to be moving into a little bit more of the modern era. Actually, we're going to start out about maybe 1,200 years ago. We'll start right where we picked up in around 700, 800 CE. Then we will move into the period of enslavement. We'll talk about that, and we'll begin our discussion, because we'll stay in that until next week, talking about African women as resistance leaders against enslavement, right at its beginning point, right on the continent, when we talk about Queen Nzinga, and we'll talk about African women attempting to reestablish African sovereignty when we talk about Kimpa Vita and the Congo Kingdom. But first, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about some African women that we don't actually have names for. And throughout this iteration of the course, I'm going to be doing that a lot. I'm going to be going back and showing you how history discusses the contributions of African women, and oftentimes they don't name these women because of the chauvinism and the worldview of the writers of this history. And they're Black, Arab, European, Asian. It doesn't matter who they are. Oftentimes it's these men writing this ancient history, and the names of these African women that made these contributions are often neglected. So we're going to talk about that today. And throughout the course, we're going to give examples of that. So you can read these histories and you can think about things differently than how you did when you first read them, because this happens to me a lot. I can read a passage so many times, but then just one little word or sentence will stand out, and you'll say, oh, that changes the entire story, or that gives it a new highlight that it didn't have. So we're going to go ahead and get started. As always, we'll break in the middle for Q&A, and then at the end, we'll have our open discussion. I mentioned this a couple of minutes ago, but I'll say it again. We are virtual again this week. I believe next week we'll be back in the studio and it'll have a new look. The renovations are being done at 235 Montreal Road. They look pretty good from what I've seen. I've seen the updates. I've been sent pictures by brother PJ, who normally does the audio visual for us, and brother Luke. So it's coming along. It's going to look really nice once we get back in there. So I'll keep everybody updated once we get to that point. All right, so let's jump right in. Yeah. All right. So we're going to start off by reviewing what we talked about last week. We're going to talk about Queen Nzinga, and then we're also going to talk about the role played by Kimpa Vita in the movement against the Portuguese in Central Africa. We will not discuss Deolindo Rodriguez today. I'm going to save her for later on in the semester when we talk about resistance against colonialism. So we won't do that one, but we will do the first two. So last week, where we left off, we talked about Dahia al-Kahina, or Dahia the sorceress, or Dahia the Amazigh, the leader of the Amazigh, or the Berbers in North Africa, as they struggled against Arab invasion after the explosion out of Arabia of the Arabs once they were united by Islam, and the beginnings of these Arab Islamic empires that would emerge in the region. So we talked about her spirited defense. Although she was ultimately physically defeated by the Arabs, her spirit of resistance lived on in the Amazigh, and even in uh, the anti-colonial struggles in the 19th and 20th century against French colonialism in the region, her name was invoked by activists, both men and women, struggling against colonialism. But an interesting thing occurs as a result of the events that happened after her defeat. Many of her soldiers, like we mentioned last week, end up joining the Arab armies, actually come to dominate the Arab armies in this part of the world in northern and northwest Africa. And it's those forces that go into Spain and Portugal and conquer in 711. So by the time we get to 711 CE, many of the Amazigh that would have been under the leadership of Dahia al-Kahina a few decades earlier are now in Spain and Portugal as conquerors, alongside Arab generals and others. But the main general that leads the charge over the Straits of Gibraltar, which are actually named for him, is General Tariq. Um, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this because it's our Sheroes class, but it's important to note that in this part of the Arab empire that has just been created, Africans play a major role in leadership positions, in military leadership positions in Spain and Portugal. And then it would come to, hold other administrative positions, so on and so forth. But when it comes to the eastern part of the empire, the part that we're going to discuss today, this is where we see Africans in a subjugated role. So in the western part of this empire, Africans are part of the conquering clique. In the eastern part of this empire, when we look around Persia, and particularly where we're going to focus today, southern Iraq, Africans are subjugated by the time we get to the 800s. So about 100 years after the conquest of Spain and Portugal, we have hundreds of thousands of Africans enslaved in southern Iraq. And these Africans are known as the Zanj, Z-A-N-J, the Zanj. They are Africans from as far north as Sudan. There's actually some Amazigh among them as well, even though they're all called Zanj. But Zanj essentially refers to East Africa. Um, it's a derivative of the term Azania, which the Greeks gave, actually it was an Egyptian, gave to the region of East Africa that we would later call the Swahili city-states. But Zanj refers to Africans from East Africa. And they have been enslaved by Arabs and taken to southern Iraq and really put into an early form of plantation style enslavement. Now, this is a really important area when we talk about African women's resistance, because this is the beginnings of a slave trade that would last for over 1,000 years. Truth be told, more people went east into enslavement than went west into the enslavement that we're more familiar with in the Americas. That period of enslavement to the west went from roughly, let's say, the late 1400s, really the 1500s, into, let's say, 1900s. So let's just say a 400-year period, because there was still some slavery ended in Brazil in 1885, but we'll round up. So let's just say 1500 to 1900. And that slave trade brought millions of people to the Americas. Now, millions of people died before they ever reached the Americas, but we get at least 10 to 12 million people in the Americas, possibly even more, but we know a lot more died in that process as well, going to the Americas in that 400 years. However, many more millions of people went east, went from East Africa, went from Sudan, went from Ethiopia, went from Somalia, into lands like Persia, north up to Turkey, as far east as India. We know of at least one enslaved person that was taken all the way to Japan. That trade to the east lasted for over 1,000 years, from around probably close to 1,200 years, from around 700 going into the early 20th century, because it was still going on. And then some could even argue it's actually still going on today when we talk about these labor agreements that send Africans to the Arab Emirates, and now they end up being virtually enslaved. But that's another story for another time. But truly, in terms of true slave trade, we're talking over 1,200 years. more people went that way. Now it's not as concentrated as it was, and in that period where anywhere between 10 and 15 million people went west in that 400-year period, but more went east. And the other major difference is this, which is important for our class discussion today. That trade to the east was primarily a trade in African women. So for the West, why were Africans transported to the West, to the Americas? To exploit their labor, on sugar plantations, cotton plantations, indigo, and mining operations in South America, of course, as domestics, all of those things, but primarily for plantation style enslaved chattel slavery was going toward the West. So there was a preponderance of men going to the West, more men than women. So let's say if we talk about 5 enslaved people, 3 of them were probably men, the other 2 were women. We flip the scenario when we talk about the trade going to the east. 2/3 of the people going east were African women. And this is another reason why this trade isn't as discussed or analyzed historically as much as it should be, because it lasted a lot longer. The other reason being it wasn't as devastating to the continent. Of course, it was devastating to the people that went through it, but to the continent itself, it wasn't as devastating for much of that period because of it wasn't as concentrated as it was in the West. You had a longer period of time people were leaving, but it wasn't devastating populations the way that it would do in the West, which we'll talk about today. So this trade to the East, being 2/3 women, is really important. And we should study it with that in mind. This was a trade largely of sexualized slavery. Sexualized slavery. I don't like to use the word concubinage, and concubines, because it kind of cleans it up from what it really is. We're talking about sexual slavery. So we're talking about African women being enslaved in East Africa, in Ethiopia, in Sudan, in Somalia, what's now Kenya, Tanzania, all the way down to Mozambique, enslaved, taken to places like Turkey, taken to places like Saudi Arabia, Oman, Persia, Iraq, India, essentially as sexual slaves. Now, you read some authors that try to clean this up and they'll say things like, well, Arab slavery wasn't as bad because, these women, if they bore children by the master, they would often be set free and they were put in kind of high places in these societies, and it wasn't necessarily racialized and all these different things. But slavery is slavery. Slavery is slavery. Forcing someone into an arrangement where their body is being exploited and they're forced to bear children and all these things. Slavery is slavery. And one of the things that's not recorded enough in the literature about this period of history is the resistance of African women. And we know that they put up resistance. No one is going into these things just willy-nilly, I just give up all my autonomy and I'm not going to fight. They fought. We know from the experiences of African women in the Americas that they fought. So why wouldn't they fight in East Africa and in these Arab worlds when they were being forced into these harems and these other forms of sexual exploitation? They fought. We know that they fought. They must have fought. But that historical record, because it was written by men with these patriarchal ideas, they don't even recognize these women as autonomous persons. It's just a collective of, we got a bunch of African sex slaves or African concubines, and they serve these Arab and Asian masters, and they bore them children. And sometimes these children would be free, and then they would go on to actually, in some cases, lead nations. We talk about Malik Ambar and India and some of these other folks. But in one instance, the historians betray themselves. Because if you're telling the history, if you look closely, you'll see the role played by African women. And one of the things that put an end to plantation-style enslavement in this region of the world, the reason why for that 1,200-year period, it was mostly sex slavery. And also, let me go back again. When I talk about sex slavery, it was also the sexual enslavement of African men too, but in a different way. So when you had these harems in Western Asia, in the Middle East, they had folks to guard these harems, and they were called eunuchs. What a eunuch is, they would take enslaved African men from, again, North Africa, Northeast Africa, uh, East Africa as well, what become the Swahili Coast. They would take these men and they would castrate them. They would either cut off their testicles or cut off their penis and their testicles, and they would make them eunuchs. Their job would be to oversee these harems. The belief being, well, if you cut off their, well, a couple of reasons. You cut off their testicles, you cut off their penis, they can't procreate. Supposedly it takes away their sexual desire, and these are the perfect security guards to watch this collection of sex slaves that, again, if it's supposed to keep other men out of the harem, but it's also, again, to keep the women in the harem. So again, we know that these women resisted because you wouldn't need a security guard if these women weren't trying to get away and run away. And we do have records of women running away. This is later on in the 19th century. We got records of African women that escaped enslavement and ran away. We'll get into them a little bit later on, but we have that. So anyway, when we talk about the sexual slavery, is also the desexing of, or the attempted desexing of African men. So all this is going on. But in the brief period that there was a version of plantation style enslavement in this region of the world, it's because of African women working alongside African men that an end was put to it. And this is a result of the Great Zand Rebellion of 869, or the Basra Rebellion of 869. Not a lot has been written about this revolt in English, but you can find a couple of books like Popovich's text, The Revolt of the African Slaves in Iraq, and there's a few other articles, an article by a guy named Sharif, who wrote about this, and I'll put it on our course website. But even in this book and in the articles, they only barely mention the role played by African women, and none of them are actually named. You have the leaders of some of the Zand revolutionaries in this text, but for the most part, the women go unnamed. But we're still going to honor them as resistance leaders. So what was going on in this region of the world? So again, what you're seeing at this time, this is the Abbasid Caliphate. This is a caliphate. I'm not going to get into all of its history, but it was founded by the Prophet Muhammad's uncle and his descendants, and they made their capital Baghdad, Iraq. Al-Mansur founded that city, and it became the capital of this caliphate. Now, one thing, the defining feature of Iraq and the defining feature of Mesopotamia going back into ancient times is the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. They played the role for this region of the world the same way that the Nile River played in Africa. Great civilizations grew up along the banks of these two rivers, from Babylon, Neo-Babylon, and others. So this is where the Caliphate decided to create its capital, right here at Baghdad. Now, if you go further south, right where these two rivers, the Euphrates and the Tigris, you come together and then empty into this Gulf here, there's a city called Basra. Now, Basra became very important because they wanted to turn it into an agricultural center for the urban areas, in the region, particularly Baghdad. But in order to do that, in order to make the soil fertile, you needed to remove a layer of nitrate from the soil. So the soil has this layer of salt, basically. Until you remove this layer of salt, you can't plant anything. It won't grow. But to remove that layer from this very potentially fertile region, you need a lot of labor and a lot of manpower to do that. So what the folks in Basra decided to do was to import hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans from East Africa. So they had slave catchers working in East Africa. They would capture people. We don't know all the ins and outs because it's not as well recorded as in the West African experience, how Africans were captured by these slave traders, but we know that it happened. And again, as far north as Sudan and as far south as Mozambique. And you might be asking, well, why Africans? Why not other folks? Well, in this particular region of the world, in Basra, if you look around, everybody is nominally Arab. Not Arab, nominally Muslim at this time. Going east into Persia, Afghanistan, Of course, the Arabian Peninsula, Egypt is becoming more and more Islamicized by the time we get to the 800s. So you're really not supposed to enslave other Muslims in Islam. So you have to look for populations that are not Muslim. There were a number of what we would call white folks enslaved in this region at this time as well, coming from this region of Europe and Western Asia. There were whites and Asians that were enslaved, but Basra, it was easy for merchants to go into East Africa, put people on boats and take them, or across the Red Sea if they're coming from Sudan, and the slave markets that existed in Arabia, and get them to Basra. So it wasn't necessarily a racialized slavery that we're going to see in the West. And even that didn't start out completely racialized, because you had indigenous people that were enslaved as well. But in Basra, in this part of the empire, it's primarily African slaves, primarily from East Africa, collectively known as the Zanj. So they're laboring on these plantations, and they're under extreme exploitation, and they decide they're going to revolt. And they're not even going to revolt to end slavery, because you got to remember, this is the 800s. At this time in the world, no one thinks that slavery in and of itself as an institution is wrong. Most populations in the world, major empires and kingdoms, are practicing slavery, because that's just what it is. It's not chattel slavery. Again, it's not like what we're going to see in the West. You could work your way out of it in a lot of instances, and different things. It's not necessarily put onto your children, so it's not the same, but it's still forced exploitation nonetheless. What they do, the Zanj organize, and they have revolts. Some are put down, some are successful, most are put down. But the major rebellion comes in 869. In 869, and this rebellion is successful for about 15 years, where the enslaved in Basra, men and women, revolt against their masters and brutally slaughter their masters and take over the region, and in fact start their own state in southern Iraq. They not only take over Basra, they take over other neighboring cities and small towns as well. And they actually form their own nation. And they actually enslave their former enslavers. That's one of the things they actually do. Again, they're not really interested in ending slavery. They're interested in not being slaves themselves. So they take over. They start enslaving the Muslim masters that used to own them. They're able to take advantage of a weakened Abbasid caliphate that can't put down the rebellion the way that they put down previous Zanj rebellions in decades earlier. So from 869 to 894, they control this region. Excuse me, 884. They control this region. They control it so much they even print their own coins, Zanj coins, as they control the region. They control trade. They really start their own nation in this area until the Abbasids are able to get their act together. They bring in a whole bunch of mercenaries, and they finally put it down. But when they put it down, the caliphate says no more importing Zanj Africans into the region in these great numbers. We'll still continue the sex slavery and domestic slavery to some extent, but never again will we import Africans for this kind of plantation style enslavement. So in essence, even though the rebellion was put down, the end result was no other Africans would have to experience this type of exploitation in southern Iraq. So they were actually successful in that regard. So we can look at the Basra rebellion and the Basra sustained revolt for 15 years as an example of a victory, because it stopped the importation of hundreds of thousands of Africans into the region. Now, when you normally hear this tale, it appears as though it's only African men that are doing the fighting and the killing and all that. And it's actually very brutal with the fighting that occurred. But you got to remember, this is 800 CE, 869 CE. So there's no guns involved. There's people are fighting with bricks and swords and mallets and hand-to-hand combat. So it's really brutal. One slight sentence in one of the great contemporary histories that records this event is done by a man by the name of Al-Turabi. I'm going backwards. Let me go to, and this is, if we zoom in, this is kind of where this takes place. It takes place in this region of southern Iraq. Um, in the history of al-Tabari, Tabari writes a 37-volume history of the world up until his time. And Tabari lived uh, from, I think, I want to say from maybe the 850s, 860s into the 900s. So he was alive when the Basra Rebellion happened, and he's Persian, so he's living in Persia, so just east of where this is taking place. So he's a historian. He writes a 37-volume history of the world up to that point. And toward the end of his book, in volume 37, he talks about the Basra Rebellion, a rebellion of the Zanj. And he writes in actually, this one is 36. It continues into 37 when he talks about how it was put down. But he provides a very interesting account. He says, Muhammad bin Hassan said the leader of the Zanj told him that when his scouts had arrived and he knew of the approaching crowd, this is one of the battles, one of the decisive battles in this revolt. He sent off Zarak and Abu al Latif al Ishbahani with a detachment of troops along the east bank of the canal, and Shibbo and Hussan al-Hamami with another attachment along the western bank. Both parties were to set up ambushes. Ali bin Aban was ordered to take the remainder of his troops to intercept the enemy. They should, however, crouch down facing the enemy, guarding themselves with their shields, allowing no one to attack until the adversaries were close enough to brandish swords at them. When the situation had developed in this way, the Zanj attacked the enemy. The Zanj leader gave orders to the two ambuscades that when the throng on the banks were abreast of them, that they heard their own troops on the attack, they should emerge on both sides of the canal, shouting at the enemy. Now, here's the key point for us. The Zanj women were ordered to gather bricks and keep the men supplied with them. That is the only sentence in this entire volume of history that talks about the role played by Zanj women outside of Zanj women being captured and put into enslavement and those types of things. But it's key because this one sentence tells us so much. It tells us that this collection of women were providing the bricks and keeping up the morale and supplying the men with those bricks, the actual weapons that they were using in this decisive battle. So this is just one battle that this was discussed. So and it doesn't seem as if it's a one-time thing that these women are doing something they're not used to doing. For a 15-year rebellion to occur, women must have played a key role in every aspect of these rebellions, including making the weaponry for the men to fight. And they probably fought in some instances themselves. So when we read these long histories, oftentimes something like this we'll skip past. Many people will just skip past and not even think about it, not think about the broader implications for what that sentence, that small sentence means for the participation of African women, which again, had the writer of this, had al-Tabari not been influenced by patriarchy, influenced by perceptions of what women could be, particularly what African women could be, because at this time also there's developing a stereotypical understanding of blackness. So even though I said the slavery wasn't racialized, racial stereotypes did emerge about the Zanj as a result of their enslavement in the Arab world. And it's striking how much of these stereotypes would carry over into the Western version of enslavement. Stereotypes about Black folks being lazy, which is funny because how can you be lazy and enslaved doing this hard work at the same time? But the Zanj being lazy, the Zanj being less intelligent, Zanj men being rapists. In fact, one of the quotes that Arabs would say about the Zanj, they would say the hungry Zanj steals, the satiated Zanj rapes. So already connecting Black men to rapists. And all of those stereotypes about the sexual anatomy of Black people that would carry on into the Western part. So this starts early. This is in the 800s, 1200 years ago, that these stereotypes are starting to emerge because of the condition that Black folks are in as a result of their enslavement at the hands of these Arabs and Persians and others. But these women resisted. They're on the front lines of this battle, making bricks, supplying the weapons, fighting against their enslavers. Because again, they, in a sense, have even more to lose than the men. Because if they're captured, what do you think the treatment of them will be at the hands of the enemy? So of course they're going to fight hard. Just like the men, they miss home. They miss being in Africa. They miss their families. They're subjected to all types of exploitation in and above what the men are actually engaged with. So they're fighting just as hard to maintain their sovereignty, to maintain their autonomy. So really important for us to look at these ancient sources with a strong eye to look for the role of African women, even if they're unnamed. We have to train ourselves to do that as we go through these texts. Look for sentences like this. Look for the unnamed African women fighting against these forces. All right, so moving on. So that's just the Zond's Rebellion. We're going to fast forward a little bit in time, and we're going to go about from the 9th century into the 16th century. So we're going to move forward about 700 years. Now we have to talk about the trade that went to the West. Long story short, Europeans make their way to the Americas. They attempt to enslave the indigenous populations in the Caribbean. For a number of reasons, it doesn't work, primarily due to lack of immunity to European diseases, their ability to escape because they know the land. And then you even have some, what should we call it, humanitarian reasons. You get the famous treatise of Bartholomew Las Casas, who's in the Dominican, and he says, we should be Christianizing these savages, not enslaving them. How about we just bring Africans? That was his suggestion. He would later go on to regret that toward his deathbed, but the damage had already been done. Africans had been enslaved by Europeans, maybe starting 50 years earlier, with the arrival of the Portuguese in West and Central Africa, starting in the 1440s. They had begun taking Africans, we've talked about this in previous classes, they'd begun taking Africans first to Portugal. They were kidnapping Africans as soon as they got to Africa in order to have ready-made translators. So they would kidnap Africans on the coast, take them to Portugal, teach them Portuguese, and then bring them back to Africa to be their translators. And they would often kidnap people and ransom them back to the kingdoms that they got them from so they could figure out what type of goods these kingdoms have. So you can imagine that. Instead of just coming in your boats and introducing yourself to the various nations that you come across in West Africa, you immediately start kidnapping people. That shows where the Portuguese mentality was at the time. But anyway, so Africans had been taken to Portugal. They had been taken to islands off of Africa like Cape Verde, the Canary Islands, taken to islands in the Mediterranean. And in the late 1400s, the Portuguese and then later on the Spanish had developed plantation-style enslavement off the coast of Africa as well as in the Mediterranean, growing sugarcane, and then they transported that method and system into the Americas. First starting with indigenous people, that didn't work out, so then they started importing Africans into the Americas in the 1500s. And again, immediately African men and women revolted against these systems, almost immediately. Even on the river in Senegal, the Ombos River in Senegal in 1447, there was a revolt against enslavement. But the Portuguese kept it up. They kept continuing to explore Africa. They eventually make their way all the way around Africa, again, slaving the entire way. And they become really the first European power to have a presence on the coast of Africa. They're going to be joined later on, of course, by the Spanish and the Dutch and the English and the French. But the Portuguese are the earliest in Africa, and they're one of the latest to leave. They don't give their colonies up until the 1980s. So let's talk about Queen Nzinga, who was one of the African leaders responsible for fighting against the Portuguese and fighting against their taking of her people into the transatlantic slave trade. Again, how do we know about her? Written record. The Portuguese colonial sources talk a lot about her. There are Italian religious sources from Capuchin monks that talk about their experience as missionaries in Angola, and they write about her. We have Dutch colonial sources that talk about her. Of course, the oral history coming out of the Kiambundu cultural area. And also, there's Kikongo oral history. It talks about her and other leaders in Central Africa as well. So this is where our evidence. In terms of great secondary sources, we have to look at the recent book that's come out 2019, um, Njinga of Angola, Africa's Warrior Queen, published by Linda M. Haywood. She's a professor of African Studies at Boston University. I think she's in the African and African American Studies department. A great scholar on Central Africa. And her book is really the only English language biography of Queen Njinga that exists, full length biography. There's a lot of articles, but none as extensive as the research that Haywood did. Because what Haywood did, Haywood went into the archives, the Portuguese archives, the Italian archives, the Dutch archives, archives in Angola, and brought this story and made it incredibly readable. So if you haven't gotten this book, I suggest you get it. It's a great read, and it's the only one of its kind in English. I think there's some Portuguese text written with about Njinga, but most of them are this is the only one that's in English. Now, you're going to hear me call her Njinga, and I might slip up sometimes and call her Nzinga, because for most of my life, whenever she was written about, her name was written as Nzinga. But recently, with analysis of the Kiambundu language, it's probably more accurate to refer to her as Njinga. That's a more accurate way of pronouncing her name. So I'm going to try to say Njinga a lot, but I learned about this lady when I was a teenager, and I've been saying Nzinga for like 20 years, so I might slip up. All right. So someone just go in the chat. Sorry. Yes, thank you, Dan. Yeah, her husband. But they're doing a lot at Boston University when it comes to the study of Central Africa. So yeah, her husband is one of those great scholars as well. All right. Um, just so for some key terms, her kingdom is the kingdom of Ndongo, which is south of the great kingdom of Congo. The people are the Mbundu people, and the language is Kiambundu. So when I talk about the Mbundu people, I'm talking about her people. Her kingdom, the name is Ndongo, kingdom of Ndongo. And she is the queen of Ndongo, and her people are the Mbundu people. A lot of these folks would, or we'll talk about that, they ultimately end up in Brazil, but we'll get into that. Like I mentioned, the Portuguese had been in this region of Africa that will become Congo and Angola since the mid 1400s, actually the late 1400s, around the 1480s, where they come. They engage first with the Kingdom of Congo, where they make their first inroads. We talked about Alfonso the First last class. We talked about snitches and sellouts. You know, the Portuguese had entered a relationship with his father. His father then rejects Christianity, rejects the Portuguese, and then he dies. And his son, Alfonso the First, who had been baptized, who really liked Portuguese culture and these types of things, he becomes the king with the help of the Portuguese. And as a result, the Portuguese really intensified their efforts and at slavery and increasing the slave trade. Because this, again, it's the early 1500s. They need labor for their new colony of Brazil. They see the Kingdom of Congo and Central Africa as a whole as a place that they can get this labor to exploit in the Americas. So even though Afonso relied on the Portuguese to put him in power, he eventually has to, you know, almost beg them to stop depopulating his kingdom for their, you know, slave efforts. The result, they don't stop. His kingdom becomes incredibly weak. It maintains itself, the Kingdom of Congo, but never with the strength that it had before Afonso's relationship with the Portuguese. We'll come back to that kingdom in a minute. But what that does is it opens the door for Africans to be exported again to the Americas, to the Brazil, to the Caribbean, Colombia, Venezuela, Mexico, of course, North America with United States, Canada as well. So that happens as a result of this relationship between corrupt leaders in Central and West Africa and European powers looking for African labor to exploit in the Americas. This is this unholy alliance. Queen Njinga is one of the just leaders in Africa that are fighting against us. And again, just like with Basra, she's not necessarily fighting to end slavery, because there's even slavery in her kingdom. It's a different type of slavery, still exploitation of labor. It's not chattel slavery. So she's not fighting to end slavery in and of itself. Nobody is at this time. General abolition is not really a thing on people's minds. But she is fighting to end the slave trade. She doesn't want to see her people going out of her kingdom to enrich the Portuguese. So that's the thing that she's fighting against. And she's very successful in doing so. We'll get more into her story in a second. I want to stop for a minute because we're well past the midpoint to open up any questions or comments that folks have. You can raise your hand and ask a question, or you can write it in the chat. David H., go ahead.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Thank you for the class. Awesome information as usual. You mentioned historical evidence was scarce for surrounding women and their role in most of the writings, the historical writings. Are there any other areas that are under contention or under investigation that also have such scarce evidence that people are interested in unveiling? You're on mute if you're speaking.
Dr. Ledbetter.
Sorry about that. Say that again. What you mean?
Because the idea is that women, if they played a very important role, most people didn't write about it. And so are there any other areas that also have such scarce evidence that are important that people want to highlight and bring to the forefront in historical writings?
Yes. So definitely women. I think when we look at history, and we have to look at it closer, also looking for the role of non-powerful people. We all think in history, talk about history from below, or some like to use the term subaltern history. So when we look at these histories, oftentimes it's written of this leader and this leader and this rich wealthy man and this rich wealthy man. But when you look in between the lines and you look closely, you can kind of see what the everyday person was doing if you look closely. So you'll see things like labor stoppages, or you'll see things like revolts that may have unnamed leaders. And you can kind of look and say, okay, this is what the everyday person was doing and how they responded to these changes or these decisions that are made by these relatively wealthy, powerful individuals that oftentimes are doing things in their own interests. Like, for example, and I'm going to be accused of doing it. I'm accusing myself of doing it today, because I am going to do it today. When we talk about the story of Njinga, it kind of overshadows what the everyday folks in the kingdom of Ndongo were dealing with, this great period of transition and fighting in their kingdom. So we don't, when the Portuguese chroniclers or the Capuchin monks that are in her kingdom trying to, evangelize the people, in their writings, although I'm focusing on what they wrote about Njinga, they might possibly talk about their interactions with everyday Mbundu people and how they thought about things. But when Linda Hayward was doing her research, she wasn't looking for those people necessarily. She's looking to write about Njinga. So if someone else wants to come along and they say, well, I want to write a people's history of the Ndongo kingdom, they're going to go back into those records, and they're going to look specifically for those types of interactions. how did those missionaries say that they interacted with the artisans or with the court officials and those type of things? So, and even when we look back at ancient Egypt, which is another reason why, you know, the research on the ancient Nile Valley is so important, is because they left so much behind. So we talk a lot about the pharaohs, and you know, last week I talked about Amani Reines, and I talked about the Mernith, the first female pharaoh. But there's a lot of records from just everyday people that had burials and they have things and autobiographies that they left behind that we can read to get a sense of what life was like for everyday people. That's another area that we should make it a point to explore, dive deep into in terms of the primary sources to find that information out. And it takes some
Awesome.
time, it takes some effort, in both oral and written history, because oftentimes even the oral history in Africa is the history of the ruling class. They pay historians to talk about my grandfather was a great king, then my father was a great king, and then my mother was a great queen mother, and then my sister was a great queen in her own right. And it talks about these royal people, and you have to really dig deep to see, well, what were the everyday people? So I would say women and everyday people.
Awesome. Thank you kindly. I'll save my other question for later.
Okay.
Thanks.
Robin, go ahead.
Yeah, man. Thank you again for, as I echo what David said, great class as always. Three comments and then a question. And the comments are all focused on, again, on this idea, part of why I love this class, of linking what we're learning to the present. So I gotta admit, I was not very aware of the African Arab slave trade, certainly not that it lasted 1,000 years. And I'm kind of it's good that we know that and understand the links to the, as you mentioned, the relationships now with like African workers and like racialized workers in general that working in these Arab oil nations and being exploited, right? Again, racialized workers, so that connection, but also so it's good that we are aware of this. But boy, I'm glad it doesn't get a lot of attention, because it could certainly be used to try to divide Black and non-Black Muslims right today, which obviously we don't want that. That's one thing. What you mentioned about the Basra Rebellion, again, it wasn't, you know, it wasn't fully a success, but it led to this kind of, you know, the end of the importation of Africans for plantation style slavery. So that's a really important thing in activism today, that you're doing things that you may not win in the end, so to speak. But even as you're going along, you have wins. So, for example, the federal Black class action suit, absolutely, like they're still struggling to get that thing certified, do all this kind of stuff. But absolutely, it's that lawsuit that led to the government announcing it's going to add Black folks to the Employment Equity Act as a distinct group, for example, right? So there's successes that come from what you do along the way, right? So before you, or maybe you may never achieve the big goal, but there's other successes that leads to, right? And then the final comment is what you said about the stereotype of Blacks being stupid. This one certainly persists today. I don't know if I mentioned that in the my own lawsuit, right? In his judgment, the white judge a couple of times used the term Mr. Brown failed to grasp blah 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 blah. And again, if you look at what he was talking about, like there's evidence in there that whatever it was, I absolutely grasped it, but he's using that language. Also, the lawyer of the two Black folks that guys I sued this week, used language like, are asking me, am I confused about the rules? And she's a Black woman. Right. So, right, so that this is being a subtle way. Anyway, the question I have, although I think you've answered it already, you said slavery is slavery, but I know in this class we've talked about kind of suggesting that African slavery wasn't as bad as the chattel slavery. So I'm assuming when we compare African slavery to the Arab slave trade, is that kind of the same argument? They're both obviously have bad elements of slavery, but they weren't as together. Neither of them were as bad. Well, as bad. Didn't have the elements of chattel slavery. Is that
Yeah,
Yeah.
and again, yeah, and you're right, and I feel that hesitation because I have the same hesitation with kind of measuring bad, but yes, like in terms of it wasn't really it wasn't really chattel slavery in the Arab world in the same way as it was with people. Like they were still people. You know, you were infidel. So when we talk about the slavery in the Arab states, the primary determinant was religion. Whether you and it's actually how slavery started out, even in the West at first. Religion was the determinant. Are you Muslim or not? Because if you're Muslim, you're not even supposed to be enslaved. Now there were problems that emerged later on. Once more and more money starts to get involved, then people start to blur that because there's a whole treatise by Ahmed Baba in who's writing in around the time of the Songhai Empire, who out of Timbuktu, who's writing against Arabs enslaving African Muslims. He's not against enslavement. He's just saying, hey, we're Muslims too. You can't. You have to check. He writes, you have to check if the person is a Muslim or not before you put them in slavery. That's the
Hello?
law. You can't just enslave uh, 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 people unless they're not Muslim. So it wasn't chattel slavery in that your property. You're still a human being. You're an infidel. We will treat you as an infidel, but you still are a human being. And there was even like some kind of semi protection, but it's still uh, exploitation. I mean, even the eunuchs. I don't know if there's anything worse than that. I mean, even though you're still alive, I mean, but you had your testicles and your penis cut off. Like what? And some people didn't even survive that, and they were very slick because there are Islamic laws that actually prohibit that action of cutting off people's testicles and penis. There's actually Islamic jurisprudence is supposed to be against that. So what they would do, they had people like right on the border or in Africa that were professional eunuch makers that did that so that by the time they got to the Arab world, they're already eunuchs so that that doesn't have to be done in Turkey, in Iran, in these it's wild. So people bend all types of rules when it comes to their economic, benefit. So, yeah, but even in Africa, like when I'm talking about Njinga, and I'm talking about Njinga, and I'm valorizing her for her resistance to the Portuguese. But if I were really, if I'm truly looking at it from the perspective that we look at a lot of things in this class, any empire in Africa, any empire anywhere is built off of exploitation. And the kingdom of Ndongo was an empire, meaning you had the core Mbundu people and their federation with the queen or the king up top. But as they expanded into other areas and took over other territories and made people tributaries, oftentimes those battles would result in the losing side being enslaved or to the other side. And that's wrong. It's wrong in every sense. So if you lost because you didn't feel like being a part of the expanding kingdom of Ndongo, that's bad. Like that's not something that anybody should have to be subjective to, just because the other side is more mighty than you. We glamorize these things and we talk about the great kingdoms and empires in Africa, but we should always remember they're empires and they're built off of exploitation too. It's just a different type of exploitation. So we should always keep those things in mind as well. Mr. Francis, go ahead.
Thank you very much, and another wonderful presentation. With regards to the women who were the suppliers of the bricks in the Jean's revolt, they essentially were providing the ammunition to the men. And I'm just wondering about the technology, what was used for propelling the bricks towards the enemies?
Probably hands. I mean, I would assume that they were throwing them because this is 800. So of course you had slings. You definitely had slings. I'm not sure if they have to look at what they would use in terms of, I don't know if catapult technology was invented as of yet, and I'm not sure they would have been using it. A lot of the fighting that was done in the Zandra, even from that short little passage that we read, there were a lot of natural and man-made canals built in that region. They were really taking advantage of those river systems, and there was a lot of swampy areas. So a lot of that fighting was done almost guerrilla style. You can even read what they wrote. It was an ambush that the Zanj had planned against the forces coming against them. So there was a lot of hand-to-hand combat. It was like really brutal. A lot of hand-to-hand combat, a lot of swords, a lot of bricks, so a lot of bludgeoning of people to death and things like that. That type of fighting. So I'm not sure if they were using, they weren't using, projectile machines like catapults and those things, but I'm sure slings were being used. And of course, people were just throwing the bricks at the folks. So a lot of intense fighting in that way. There's not even firearms at this time. This is 800. So yeah, that's what they were doing. So they're baking these bricks, using these bricks, and throwing them at the enemy. And yeah. Other questions. I see the question in the chat, Gina. Not that I know of. I mean, acknowledging the fact that a lot of these places, they acknowledge it because it's their history in terms of there are populations of African descendant people still in these places. In Iran, there's a large section of Afro-Iranians that are a result of enslavement, particularly recent enslavement in terms of the 18th and 19th century, where you had another major explosion of Africans into that part of the world. So but in southern Iraq, the Afro-Iraqis are descendants of the Zanj folks. So you have, I think, close to 1 million Afro-Iraqis in southern Iraq that are fighting against the scrim. They're fighting just like Africans all over the world and other places. They're fighting for political representation. They're fighting against discrimination. They're fighting against stereotypes, all these things. So there's a sizable population in southern Iraq that are direct descendants of the Zanj rebellion. In Turkey, there are Afro-Turks. Again, these are more recent Africans whose ancestors came in the 19th century, even the early 20th century. So those nations acknowledge that those populations are there to some extent. But in terms of any type of formal apologies or anything, no, I don't think any of them have done anything like that. And part of it is because those populations are just now becoming more emboldened. I'm not saying now, I'm saying within the last 20 years, are becoming more emboldened to identify themselves and fight as Afro-descendant people. They spend a lot of the time, many of them trying to just do their best to kind of blend in, even though it was known that you are an Afro-descendant person, so we're going to discriminate against you. But now they've become more emboldened. I think, and I don't know this to be 100% sure. I mean, I know it slightly. The internet and other things have played a major role in connecting Afro-descendant communities around the world. So that increased visibility has helped them coalesce and fight and to get global attention to what's been going on with them in Iran, in Iraq, in Turkey, and these other places. And they're sharing notes, they're sharing information, they're sharing experiences, and they're forming movements off of that. And they're relatively new in terms of their movements. They've been isolated for hundreds of years, particularly in Iraq. They've been isolated, and you wouldn't even know that they were there unless you were actually there in Iraq. And of course, the West wasn't looking for these people as well, or giving them any attention either. So, and then again, it goes back even to something Robin had brought up in terms of even Black folks not really talking about the issues of these populations. There's a lot of our people are Muslim. And even in terms of the history of the United States, in terms of Black studies and Black radicalism, because of Malcolm X and other things, there was a period in time where Islam was associated with progress with Black people. So there wasn't a whole lot of criticism of things that were going on in the Islamic world because they were seen as allies in a third world struggle against, white supremacy. But then when you dig deeper, like Malcolm, when he went to Arabia and he went to Egypt. He didn't talk about the anti-black racism of a lot of those Arabs that were there because they didn't show him that. They showed him the best parts of the Arab world and how they perceived him because they wanted Islam to spread in America because they thought, well, we get more Muslims, then uh, more people would come and make Hajj. There was money to be made with that. There's influence to be had with that. So they courted Malcolm X. Had Malcolm lived longer and really saw what was happening in those places with darker skinned Africans in Egypt, what was going on with Africans in Arabia, and how even to this day there are Africans that are still discriminated against when they go make Hajj in Mecca. He might be a little bit more critical of some of the quote unquote leaders of the Islamic world. Um, those are some of the reasons why a lot of this stuff isn't as known and is talked about as much. And even now, and this is kind of controversial to say, and I'm almost hesitant to say it because of what's going on in the world. And I don't want this to be taken as any type of anti-solidarity with the Palestinian people, but there are instances of anti-black, anti-African racism in Palestine. I'm talking about occupied Palestine because there were populations of African people that were that were enslaved in Palestine. I'm talking about before all this, before 1948, in the 1800s, early 20th century, there were Africans that were enslaved in Palestine. And there are remnants of those populations in Palestine that have reported in recent decades the racism that they've experienced at the hands of Palestinians. So even in this whole struggle, and again, it's right to be righteous on the side of the Palestinians, African people should look at that situation and say, okay, we're going to be in solidarity with you, but let's just say you get everything together. And the philosopher who came up with this political philosophy, political social theory of Afro-pessimism named Frank Wilderson. Frank Wilderson was a lot more negative than I am about it, but he makes us think like, okay, if the Palestinians ever get liberation, what does that mean for the people of African descent in Palestine? Are they going to continue the anti-black bias that some of them had? I'm talking about for Africans in Palestine. So that's something that, again, you don't bring it up too much in a lot of these spaces because you don't want to give any fuel to divide the world from being in righteous solidarity with the Palestinian people and what they're going through right now. But it's there. And as an African person, I'm not going to just completely ignore that while you struggle for your freedom. I'm not going to have it, be used to discourage what you're doing. But when you're done with that, we need to have a discussion about how you treat African people and ensure that you're not continuing those practices. All right. Let me get back into it because, I kind of went off a little bit on that. We can talk more about that at the break. So anyway, the slave trade is ongoing, and this is what Njinga is encountering. It's an uptick in the slave trade, particularly by the time we get to her time period, which is 1624 to 1663 is when she lives. So she is the daughter of a future king, of a king of Ndongo, Mbande A Ngola. Angola. He was the king. The Portuguese are in the area. Their political system is very similar to the Kingdom of Congo and very similar to other kingdoms or empires in Africa, where you have a king, but then you also have a number of regional governors, vassals underneath the king with their own regional power. And then they pay taxes to the king and it goes up, but they do have their own regional power. And oftentimes the king's role or the queen's role, whoever's at the top of this pyramid, their responsibility is to keep everybody on every level satisfied so that those people continue to give surplus to the king. The king uses that surplus to then give gifts to other folks and keep this whole thing balanced. The king also has spiritual responsibilities as well. You're one of the main people communicating with the ancestors, providing spiritual power and stability to the kingdom. So you have that responsibility as well. Oftentimes, these kings would take multiple wives from the various sisters and daughters of the regional rulers to keep everything in line. So that way, when the king dies, there are a number of successors coming from the kingdom. That's how the balance is kind of kept. But the Portuguese and the others enslavers were able to take advantage of these political systems because they could always wait until a king died, or not even wait until a king died. They could cause division in this system by going to one regional leader and say, hey, maybe you should be king, or maybe your region should succeed. And guess what? We will arm you in your battle against the king or your battle against your neighbor in order for you to be successful. And, while you're fighting, anybody you capture, just go ahead and sell them to us. It'll get rid of a lot of your enemies, and it will also make you richer in the process. So a lot of regional leaders with ambitions to be king or ambitions to start their own empire, maybe extraterritorially, so they would expand maybe to the west or the east or the south or the north or whatever, and take over other peoples to make their own kingdom, working with the Portuguese, getting weapons, possibly even mercenaries to do this thing. And as they're engaging in their wars, their war captives will be sold to the Portuguese. So it doesn't matter who wins the war for the Portuguese. They're going to get captives. So they would instigate these wars over succession, wars of expansion, all this chaos in order to get captives that will be shipped to the Americas. So that's the political context that she's born into. When her father dies, her brother takes over. Ngola Mbande, he takes over. Actually, no, that's her father. That's her grandfather's Mbande, her father's Ngola Mbande, and then her brother takes over. Wait, no, I'm sorry, I'm getting this wrong because I'm getting mixed up by the dates that I'm looking at on here. That date, 1624, that is her period, I think, where she rules. I don't think that's when she was born because she lives a lot longer than that. Yes, that's a period where she rules. That's where I got confused. Sorry about that, y'all. I didn't mean to confuse you with the numbers. Yes, that's the period that she ruled from 1624 to 1663. These aren't the dates that they lived. These are the dates that they ruled. So her father ruled from 1592 to 1617, and then her brother takes over. Now her brother wants to rule, and he doesn't want any challenges. So one of the things that her brother does, that's highlighted in the book by Linda Haywood, he actually kills Njinga's son, her young son, and he has his two other sisters sterilized so that they can't have children. So Njinga has a child, her child is killed, and his other two sisters, he has them sterilized. He also has this working relationship with the Portuguese because they're major players in the region. So after he does that and he has firm control over the crown, he sends Njinga to the Portuguese as his representative. Now, this is where she kind of comes into the historical record. We don't know exactly how she felt. Well, actually, we're going to find out how she felt about her son being killed and her sisters being sterilized in a minute, but we'll get to that. So, but she still ends up working on behalf of her brother. She has a position, it's an unnamed position, but she is a prince. She's a royal figure in the kingdom. So when he sends her to the Portuguese as almost to do some negotiations, this is where she comes into the historical picture. So Njinga goes on behalf of her brother, and she gets baptized, and baptized in the name of, or baptized with the new name Anne. I think she gets the Portuguese name Anne or Anna. It was the name of the Portuguese governor's wife at the time, who's her godmother. Yeah. So she goes there, and one of the great episodes in African history happens because when she gets to the Portuguese to negotiate on behalf of her brother, they don't provide her a seat for the negotiations. But she has an entourage. Let me see if I can pull up this picture. And one of the most famous episodes in African history, she snaps her fingers essentially and makes a gesture, and one of the members of her entourage gets down on all fours, and the other provides a back, and she uses that person as a seat when she negotiates for the Portuguese to show them that you were going to disrespect me by having me stand for this entire meeting, but you don't understand the type of power I have, that I can just snap my fingers and make somebody get down. And again, going back to what we talked about at the break, I am very interested in the history of the person on their knees. That I'm much more interested in that history than necessarily in Jenga when I really look back at African history. Because what are they thinking at this whole time? Like, I got to do this. They might be thinking, this is my queen. I'm not going to let her be embarrassed. I'm going to assume this position and do this. But, it's these people, their lives that we don't get enough of. But anyway, it just goes to show how powerful Njenga was. And it made an incredible impression on the Portuguese. Because as they're negotiating with her, she is able to show how astute she is at politics because she'd been trained very well by her father, who, truth be told, really wanted her to succeed him and not her brother. Her brother really wasn't that great of a politician. He was kind of a weak guy. And in fact, Njenga plays on his weakness and ultimately gets him to probably kill himself. So as the Portuguese are looking for more enslaved labor and they're advancing and they're doing these things, the Portuguese are continuing to demand things from him to the point that they want him to get baptized as well. Becoming Christian is a part of their diplomatic efforts. And Njenga tells him, you can't get baptized. Look, you represent our ancestors here on earth. Me and your other sisters, we did their little ritual to get baptized, but you're the king. You shouldn't do that because you represent our ancestors. And she, continues to kind of berate him and attack his sense of security and who he is as a person with these little jabs and things at him. And she also, at the same time, is accruing around her a lot of the nobles and a lot of the regional leaders that are, important in the kingdom. It gets to the point that from her attacks on his person and his inability to stop some of the other regional leaders from succeeding and joining the Portuguese against him and weakening his kingdom, that he eventually kills himself in 1624. Because of the power that she's able to amass around herself and other folks in the kingdom really seeing that, this is the person that we should rally behind, she's able to take the throne. And now here comes her revenge. Her brother did have a young son. So once she takes the throne, she has him killed. So I guess it's a son for a son. So he killed her son, she killed his son. She had his son killed, so that there's no possible challenge from his family for her position on the throne. When she becomes queen, there are still some of those regional leaders that have allied themselves with the Portuguese that refuse to acknowledge her as queen. So she begins a number of battles against those regional leaders that have allied with the Portuguese in order to solidify her position. And also, she's never really had a love for the Portuguese. Yeah, she got baptized, but that was on behest of her brother. She wants autonomy, and she sees the Portuguese as a threat to the sovereignty of her kingdom. So she's already allying her forces to make this battle against the Portuguese. So in this process, going from her father to her brother to her, fighting is going on. And again, the Portuguese are benefiting from all of this, even if they're on the losing side, because there are still captives to be had and captives to be sold and taken to the Americas, primarily Brazil. And here's where another element of our story occurs. If you look at this map, you'll see that a majority of Africans are taken from Central Africa and taken right to Brazil. It's actually the shortest reach from what's now Angola and Congo to Brazil. And the Portuguese took advantage of this. This is why 40% of all Africans, 40% of all Africans that were enslaved in the Americas were enslaved in Brazil. This is why today Brazil has the highest population of Black people of any country other than Nigeria. So if Brazil was in Africa, it would be the second most populous African country. That's how many Black people are in Brazil. And it's a result of, again, Portuguese instigating these wars in states, between states, that allowed these captives to go. But the other aspect of it, when we look at the story of what occurs in Brazil, these African men and women that are captured in these wars, they don't necessarily, many of them don't stop fighting once they get to Brazil. They continue to struggle. They continue to struggle against enslavement, and often they're able to form their own communities, quilombos, the quilombo communities in Brazil. The larger of these settlements are called quilombos, the smaller ones are called mucambos. But essentially, both of those are Central African terms meaning war camp. A mucambo or mucambo is a small war camp, and a quilombo is a large war camp. And those words would become synonymous with the activities of Africans in Brazil. And the largest is Angola Janga, or Little Angola, which the Portuguese called the Republic of Palmares, which lasted for almost 100 years, from around the early 1600s to the late 1600s. The same time that Njinga is queen. A lot of this is overlapping. So many of those captives, whether they were on Njinga's side or on the side of some of these regional rulers that allied themselves with the Portuguese, or from other kingdoms like the Kingdom of Congo, all of those wars that are happening in Central Africa are providing the folks that when they get to Brazil, they're like, why stop fighting now? And they keep fighting, and they eventually, and many of them free themselves. Not all of them, but a good many free themselves, and they form their own communities with very similar political setups that they had in Africa, because they've never really been enslaved. They were able to get free, and then they reproduced in these areas. You got to remember, Angola Janga lasted for over 90 years. So you got generations that lived there. They engaged in agriculture. They fortified their territories. They actually even engaged in trade with other Portuguese folks in Brazil and indigenous people. And there were poor whites in these quilombos sometimes as well. But they were run by the Africans coming from this cultural area of Central Africa. So, and many of them were women. A lot of the leaders of these quilombos were women. There's Teresa de Benguela, who had a quilombo a little bit after this time period in northeastern Brazil that she ran. In Angola Janga, one of the last leaders was Dandara of the Palmares, or Dandala of Angola Janga, who was the wife of Zumbi. These were the last two rulers of Angola Janga before the Portuguese was finally able to defeat it in 1694. And Dandara is another great symbol of African women. And in Afro-Brazilian history and Afro-Brazilian activism, her name is often invoked as one of the many women that led quilombos, these communities of, again, Africans reestablishing their sovereignty in the Americas. So fighting and resistance is being led by African women on both sides of the Atlantic in the 16 and 1700s. So they're fighting and they're connected. So it's really important to understand that. So again, we'll go into the rest of her resistance. So for the rest of her political career, Njinga is fighting against the Portuguese. She uses religious and political diplomacy. Like I said, getting baptized, sending letters to the Portuguese saying, all right, this will be the boundaries. This is what's going to happen. You're not going to take any more of the free people of my kingdom. And she used diplomacy. When that failed, she used military forces. She used tactical retreats and conquered new areas. She actually had another kingdom that she conquered when the Portuguese had corrupted enough officials in her kingdom to make her lose territory. She just went further east and conquered the kingdom of, I think it was Matamba, the kingdom of Matamba. She conquers it and becomes queen over there and adds to her territory, and then continued to resist against the Portuguese. She got initiated into one of the most ruthless organizations that existed in Central Africa at the time, the Mbangala, where actually we get the term Quilombo from. These were a group of Africans that lived in Central Africa that saw the unstable situation that was being created by the Portuguese insatiable desire for African labor, that they formed a nation of fighters. I said, we're not going to be taken in the slave trade. We're not going to be pawns of these regional leaders that will use us for battle. We'll form our own fighting mobile nation that you can't join, you have to be initiated into. And we will fight against anyone. We'll fight against Africans, we'll fight against Portuguese, we'll fight for the Portuguese, we'll fight for Africans, but we will always be on the war path and on war footing because we don't want to be enslaved. So the Mbangala was a really interesting semi-nation of people that weren't necessarily always connected ethnically, religiously. They were initiated into this organization in order to constantly stay on the offensive. So she actually joins the Mbangala and she says, I'm going to be initiated into this group so that I can use their fighting force in my struggles against the Portuguese. She took advantage of European rivalries. At this time, the Portuguese are fighting the Dutch, and this is all tied into the intertribal problems of the Europeans at the time as well. The Protestant Reformation happens, and this causes all types of violence in Europe. Of course, and they're also fighting over control of colonies and such as well. So the Portuguese and the Dutch are engaged in a battle that take place on both sides of the Atlantic. The Dutch actually control Brazil for a time, and they control Angola for a time. Well, Queen Njinga sees all this. So she allies herself with the Dutch because she says, my enemies, the Portuguese, they're fighting the Dutch. Let me ally with the Dutch and I'll fight against the Portuguese. And she took advantage of that. And she was able to, again, maintain her own autonomy and sovereignty by taking advantage of these European rivalries. Finally, in 1657, when the Portuguese realized they couldn't defeat her, a peace treaty was signed, which recognized her territory and restored her as queen. At least she never lost it in her own eyes, but in terms of the Portuguese. And she got a lot of her territory back. And in her territory, you had these communities of Africans that she had liberated from the Portuguese. Again, not because she was against the institution of slavery in and of itself, but she said, I'm not going to let the Portuguese take these people into the slavery going to the West. So she would actually, her troops would liberate Africans that were bound to go to the Americas and have them incorporated into her kingdom and as warriors and workers in her kingdom as a way of weakening the Portuguese. So really important figure that we should look at in terms of all the tactics that she used to fight against this power, to maintain the sovereignty of her kingdom. We can look at the negative aspects of her reign as well, in terms of, again, not completely stopping slavery in her own kingdoms, but definitely fighting against the slave trade, and just my general negative attitude toward monarchies, but that's another conversation. We can put that on the negative side as well. But we're going to valorize her today in her efforts to fight against the Portuguese. So really important figure, someone worth studying, someone worth your attention. And it's really just an interesting read. They made a nice Netflix series about her that came out, I think last year or year before. And it's actually pretty good. A lot of it is actually based on Linda Hayward's work. I could tell from the things that they brought up in the video, even if they didn't credit Linda Hayward's work, I'm pretty sure a lot of that information was based off it. And they have good historians and other folks that it's a series, but it's also a documentary as well. And it's one of the better ones that they actually did. So if you don't want to read the book, check out that documentary first and then go read the book. Always read the books because these documentaries, they do add stuff. And of course, they have to add dialogue that might not necessarily be historical, but it moves the story forward. So always read the books first and then watch the documentary. But if you got to watch the documentary first, do that, but then read the book so you can see what really happened. All right, last person I'll talk about, and just in terms of Sankofa, she's remembered. Queen Njinga is honored in Angola with statues, streets named after her, institutions named after her, because the Portuguese would ultimately, after she died, her sister took over, and then the Portuguese would later conquer the entire area and it would become incorporated into the colony of Angola, which wouldn't be liberated until 1975. So the Portuguese are, again, the first in Africa and some of the latest to leave. And in that battle to get them ultimately out, Njinga was invoked a lot by the freedom fighters in the MPLA and the other forces that are fighting against the Portuguese. Young man, hush. Go get your coat off. Go get your coat off. I'll see you soon. A little bit further north, and this is where we'll kind of stop today. A little bit further north in the Kingdom of Congo, you had the figure of Kimpa Vita, who lived in a few decades after Nzinga, and she's also known as Donna Beatrice. Her story is really interesting as well because she wasn't a royal figure. She's closer to everyday people. But she used spiritual resistance to fight against the Portuguese and to strengthen the Kingdom of Congo, which had been weakened again from Portuguese interference going all the way back to Afonso I. What she was able to do. And the book that you should read about her is written by John K. Thornton, who's also at Boston University with Linda Haywood. It's called Congolese Saint Anthony, Donna Beatrice, Kimpa Vita, and the Antonian Movement, 1684 to 1706. This is a great book that talks about her life, and John K. Thornton does good research on Central Africa, and he's a European guy, actually. So this is where she lived, the Kingdom of Congo, which again, just north of Ndongo. At the time, a civil war was occurring where you had essentially two rulers of the Kingdom of Congo, two men fighting for the crown. You had Pedro the Fourth and João II. You see at this time, they all have Portuguese names because essentially the Kingdom of Congo had been in this relationship with the Portuguese for over 200 years now. So a lot of chaos. And again, in this chaos, the Portuguese are exporting people to the Americas as a result of all this chaos. So whenever there's a civil war or any type of war, the Portuguese are benefiting. So she's coming up in this time. And at a certain point in her life, she becomes possessed by the spirit of Saint Anthony, according to her. Prior to this, she had been initiated as a priestess in the Congo spirituality in the Kempasi Society. So she has experience with spiritual training and using spiritual power to affect the community. And many of the everyday people in the Kingdom of Congo at this time are Catholic. It had trickled down from the monarchy into the everyday population, but it is a Catholicism that is mixed with African spirituality as well. So when she claims to be possessed by Saint Anthony, is really significant because Saint Anthony is the patron saint of Portugal. So by her saying this, she is challenging the Portuguese. And that's not the only challenge that she makes. She says, Saint Anthony, when she speaks, it is Saint Anthony speaking. So that's the authority that's speaking. And when she's under this possession of Saint Anthony, she says, everything the Portuguese have told us is a lie. The things that happened in the Bible actually happened in Africa, happened in Congo. And all the people in the Bible were Black, were Africans. And the Portuguese are hiding this fact from you in order to exploit you. And unlike Nzinga, she was against slavery. This may have been because she was, again, closer in her position, that she was an everyday person. She had some relationship to the monarchy, but she was really an everyday person. So she was against the slave trade and against slavery. And she wanted the Congo kingdom to be united. All the civil wars to stop. She wanted the Portuguese out. She wanted slavery to be ended. And she wanted this African-centered understanding of Christian theology, which flips everything. That everything happened in Africa. That Jesus was born in Africa. All the biblical stories happened in Congo. And the Portuguese are hiding this from you because they're trying to hide from who you really are. She was said to have performed miracles under the possession of St. Anthony. She healed people, possibly even brought people back from the dead, according to some of the legends. And she amassed a great following. So much so, and the Portuguese are incensed by this. The fact that this woman, this African woman, had the audacity to say that she was possessed by their patron saint and was said to be performing these miracles. They called it blasphemous. They said she was really possessed by a demon. And the fact that she would even challenge the idea that the people in the Bible were not anything but white was really an affront to them. So they attempted to destroy her movement, and they tried to attack it, and they ended up attempting to try to assassinate her and many of her followers. But the movement continued to grow and grow and grow. It gets kind of interesting toward the end because she gets pregnant at some point, and then the Portuguese are saying, "Well, how could she be possessed by Saint Anthony?" And this woman is clearly, pregnant and all of this. This is just any other woman. And ultimately, when she does pass away, her followers continue in terms of this Antonian movement, and they continue to challenge the Portuguese. Ultimately, the Portuguese use some of the leadership in Congo that are fighting against her to destroy her movement, and they actually enslave a number of her followers and transport them to the Americas. Where, just like in the case of Njinga, her followers continue to fight. And there's a huge rebellion that happens in the United States, actually called the Stono Rebellion. And many folks think that that was led by people that were Antonians, that were people that were followers of her movement that happens in the 1700s. So really interesting figure. Again, I won't spend a lot of time on it because time is running out. We want to stop for the day. But if you can find this book, which is readily available on Amazon, Congolese St. Anthony, get it, read it, and you can find out more about King Pavita and her spiritual resistance. So we'll stop there for today. I open it up for any questions, comments,